Hello, advanced social psychology students. So the purpose of this video is to present a summary of article number 1 as my lead to this discussion. And the way I'm doing it is the way I'm sort of giving you an example of how I hope you're going to do, how you're going to lead the article discussions. Remember, when you lead your article discussion, it's worth 100 points, and it includes you presenting in Harmonize, a presentation that goes through each of the studies in your article, and then you present some of the discussion questions that your classmates had presented. And then as the classmates, you guys all add your posts to start discussing it as though we were sitting in a room discussing it. You lead the discussion. So if people start to get off track, you bring them back into the fold. If there's, no one's posting for a little bit, you kind of maybe move to the next discussion question, move it along. So, and each of you, if that are not leading the article, need to make 2 posts by the end of the week. So this very first one I'm doing because of the snowstorm and because no one else chose it. Now, I just finished grading your article summaries and I was so impressed. There were, I think, 2 of you that correctly identified most of the independent variables and dependent variables in the 5 studies. And that's like almost unheard of. Like, it's very rare that a student on the very first article summary is good at identifying all the independent variables and dependent variables. Usually it's about halfway through the semester when students get good at that. So I was really impressed. And if you are one of the ones who, got those all wrong, that's okay. Really, you'll get all 10 points as long as you address each of the areas in the template. And when I read your conclusion sections, it's clear that you understood the main points of the study, of each of the studies. You'll still get all 10 points. And I'll always give you feedback. This time I gave you less specific feedback. I told people to just watch this video. But oftentimes I'll give lots of very specific feedback so you'll know exactly what the independent and dependent variables are. Another comment I do have, recommendation for most of you, is I'd encourage you to put more detail in your brief description of the method sections so that when you go to take the Unit 1 exam or the Unit 2 exam, you're not going to have to go back and reread the article or look at the article. You would be able to just use your article summaries to answer those questions. Some of you have not very much information in there, and I'm afraid by the time it comes to the exam, you're going to have forgotten what this article was, especially because you're going to have read so many more. And so really going back and I wouldn't necessarily go back to this one, but in the future, present a lot of details in that section to help you. I don't need them, but to help you so when you're taking that open book, open notebook, open notes, open everything exam, except you can't use another student to help you. Okay, well, without further ado, let me start going through. I'll share my screen here so we can start talking about the article for this week. I hope you saw how this is just hot off the press. This was published or accepted for publication in December of 2025. And here it is, February 2026. So this just came out 2 months ago. So talk about cutting edge. You can't get any more, it would be difficult to get more cutting edge than this. So the problem that this article is trying to solve, or these groups of experiments is trying to solve, is that one might argue, especially right now, it's really important for us to be able to have productive conversations with people, especially people who have ideas and views that are very different from our views and our ideas. Right now in the United States and in other countries, all you have to do is look at TikTok or Facebook or some other platform, and it seems as though people are very polarized. One way to, and that's a shame. It leads to, it's harder to feel a sense of community and that we're all in this together. And so, in order to have these productive conversations, we need to feel that the people that we're communicating with are open and receptive to the information that we have, even information that's different from theirs, right? Now, one of the things that the authors had talked about or had found in prior studies is that people tend to be more receptive if they believe the person that they're talking to is more receptive to these different ideas. However, it's how do you set that up, especially when people really do have conflicting points of view. It might be hard to let the recipient know that you really are open to their point of view, even though their point of view is really different. So what can be done to increase people's receptiveness to these contradicting views? And so the authors thought maybe framing can play a role. So you learned about framing in the chapter that you just read, chapter 2 on social cognition. And we know that how we frame things, how we begin to talk about something, very much affects the way that we process the information. So is it possible that framing, the way we frame our view, our opinion about something, would lead the person we're communicating with to feel that we're more open to receive their feedback, their points of view, which then would lead them to be more open, and we'll have this nice spiral and have great productive conversations. And by framing, just to remind you, I know you've all read the article and most of you submitted a summary for it, but you, let's say you're pro-life. If you're pro-life, you can start talking about that by using a support frame sentence like, I support banning abortions, or an opposed frame stance like, I oppose allowing abortions. You can see you're saying the same thing here, but one, you're saying what you support, one, you're saying what you oppose. Someone who's pro-choice, support framed sentence would be, I support allowing abortions. You can get that same idea across in opposed frame by saying, I oppose banning abortions. So you can see that regardless of your opinion, pro-life or pro-choice, you can frame it in either a support or an opposed fashion. Okay. And the article, as you know, has other examples of this, not just pro-life, pro-choice, but I just wanted to throw that in there. So the rationale that they had at the beginning, which turns out to be true, they end up finding support for their hypotheses, is that so way back in 2021, they found that people find support framed attitudes as more reflective of their own core values, their own worldview, congruent with their values. And when that happens, they're more receptive to the message that's coming around, that they're hearing. So they thought that because people think that people realize that they're more receptive to support frame messages, they think other people will be more receptive to support frame messages. And they think that other people, even people who disagree with them, will be more receptive to support frame messages. And that might be true. But it could be that disagreeing others have different core values. And if that's the case, then it might be that actually opposed frame messages are better at leading the receiver of the message to be more receptive. So the authors want to see which is going on. First of all, do people believe that disagreeing others will be more receptive to support frame messages? Is that even true? And then if that is true, are the receivers actually more receptive to oppose frame messages? Is that true? And does value congruence mediate this relationship? In other words, the reason why people find the support or think that support frame messages are going to lead to more receptiveness is because people believe that it is more congruent with their values. And the reason why the receivers of the messages are actually more receptive to opposed frame messages is because the opposed frame messages are more congruent with their values. So does the value congruence mediate this relationship between framing and receptivity? So they begin with study one. And so with study one, it starts with they're using data initially from a prior study that asks, thousands and thousands of people, a whole bunch of questions about all different attitudes that they have. And one of the questions on this survey asks people's attitudes toward abortion, whether they're pro-life, pro-choice, or neither. And if you said that you were pro-choice or pro-life, then you were invited to be in this study number one. They did not want to include people who didn't have a strong opinion toward about this issue, because remember, they're trying to look at what our conversations are like when we're talking to people who have very different views from ours. And then in the last study, people have similar views to ours. So they didn't want someone who wasn't going to be similar or wasn't going to be very different, because they don't have a strong opinion either way. So if you chose pro-life or pro-choice, then you're asked to be in the study. Once you're in the study, you were told that you were going to be matched with a prior participant who either supported or opposed the statement legalizing abortions after 6 weeks is either good or bad. In reality, they were always told that the prior participant disagreed with their own position. So they're always talking to someone with a contradictory view. And also in reality, they didn't really see what the another person said. Instead, they were shown a target message, the position statement, and reasons for the position that were created by the experimenter. And here's an example of one. So in the article, it gives this example. So a participant, maybe participant number 240, would be shown. Participant number 239 was asked their attitude toward this statement and given an opportunity to write a message. Please read their position and message below carefully. You may be asked questions about their position and/or message. Their position is, I am in support of the statement, legalizing abortions after 6 weeks is good. And the message is, and the message is allowing abortions after 6 weeks allows women in bad situations to get abortions. The reality is that most women don't even know that they're pregnant until week 6. If we don't allow abortions after 6 weeks, that means that many women, as well as teenage girls, will be forced to have children that they're not ready for and can't support well. Now, remember, this would be given to someone who is pro-life. In other words, someone who does not think legalizing abortions after 6 weeks is good. Okay, so, but this is what I'm trying to give you an idea, a very concrete idea of what the subjects would read. After they read this, they would then answer some key questions about how receptive they are to this message. Also, half the people were told that they were going to play the role of the communicator. So they were asked to imagine that they're sending this message to the prior participant. The other half of the people were told you're going to be the recipient. And so the recipients were told, how would you feel if you received this message from the prior participant? Okay, so they're shown the same information, but some are told, imagine that you're sending this. Others are told, how would you feel if this is the message that you got? And it's either framed in a, I am in support of the statement, or opposed, I am against the statement, okay? And the dependent variables were how receptive the person was. So communicators predicted how receptive they thought the recipients would be, and recipients indicated how receptive they actually were, or they think they would be. Value congruence was also measured. So all participants indicated how value congruent they thought the message was for them. Okay. And the results were exactly like they expected. For receptiveness, the communicators believed recipients would be more receptive to support frame messages than opposed frame messages. But in reality, the recipients were actually more receptive to opposed frame messages than support frame messages. And for value congruence, for communicators, value congruence felt higher for the support frame messages than the opposed frame messages. And for recipients, value congruence felt higher for opposed frame messages than support frame messages. And sure enough, they did a mediational analysis and found that value congruence absolutely mediated the relationship between framing and receptiveness. So if framing led to high value congruence, then you were more receptive. You either thought that someone would be more receptive or you guessed that you would be more receptive. So they got support for their hypothesis. Wow. So they also ran a couple other studies that they didn't include in this paper. My guess is that the reviewers said, well, just because this is true with abortion, maybe it would be different with some other issues. So they did the exact same study, but instead they used same-sex marriage rather than abortion. And then I suspect that some editors that were looking at the article were like, well, the experimenters made these messages, so maybe there's something in that. What are real communicators like? And so in some supplementary studies, the communicators actually wrote their own messages, meaning that the recipients read actual messages, and they found the same pattern of results. So basically, this really seems to be true. So in the next two studies, they're going to sort of ask, in kind of a flip way of saying it is, well, who cares? So what if people are more receptive? What does that matter? So in studies 2 and 3, they're asking, what are the behavioral consequences of being more receptive? If you are more receptive, what's going to happen? And in study 2, they ask, are receptive people more willing to engage with counter-attitudinal content? So for this study, they again went to one of those subject pools where they've answered all these questions, and they only invited people to be in the study who self-described themselves as liberal and had all used Reddit. And then once these people agreed to be in the study, they were told that they were going to be shown a series of posts on Reddit that were titled Political Discussion, and that they'd be asked to select a post that they would like to read and comment on. And then they were shown 4 posts, all that argued conservative values. But 2 of the posts were framed with support frame messaging, and 2 of them were framed with opposed framed messaging. And so they're shown all 4 of them, and they're looking, okay, which one are they going to choose to read and write comments in, to engage in? So the independent variable was the frame, support or oppose, and the dependent variable was which post did they select to read, which topic did they engage in. And the results were, as expected, the participants were more likely to choose to read an opposed frame post. So not only are people more receptive, but also they're more willing to engage with this counter-attitudinal content. In other words, content that's clearly going to talk about a message in a way that we disagree, that they're more likely to engage in this if the initial message is framed in an opposed framed fashion. So that's kind of exciting. In study 3, they're like, okay, this is kind of cool. We know that opposed framing leads to more receptiveness when you're talking to a disagreeing other. And this receptiveness seems to lead you to be more likely to engage in a post and comment on it and such. Will it actually make it more likely for you to change your attitude? Because when we're as polarized as we are right now, if we're not really listening and we're not receptive and not willing to change our attitudes to some extent, it's going to be really hard to get some common ground. So here, again, they used a study that had been done before, like one of those big surveys, and they focused on people's views on a junk food tax. And they looked again at people, they invited people to be in the study who either supported the junk food tax or were opposed to the junk food tax. If you were neutral, you were not invited to be in the study, because again, they're trying to look at people with opposing views. So what happened is, because the initial study where you had to say whether you supported, opposed, or neutral on that was part of a survey that was given, probably months before you were invited to be in this study. So once you were invited to be in the study, it began with them asking your initial attitude. Do you think it's good to have a junk food tax? And you were to rate it on a scale from 0 to 100, 0 being good, 100 being bad. Then you read a 3-paragraph long essay that that said the opposite of whatever you thought. So if you're pro junk food tax, this was 3 paragraphs long talking about how that's a bad idea. If you were against the junk food tax, then you read this big long 3-paragraph thing that's going on and on about how it's a terrible idea. But regardless of whether it was pro or con, it was either framed in a support framed way or an opposed framed way. At the end of that, after the end of reading the 3 paragraphs, they had to state how receptive they were to the essay. And then they were asked to ask their attitude again on the 0 to 100 scale. To what extent do you think the junk food tax is a good idea? 0 is good, 100 is bad. So the independent variable was framing, support or oppose, and the dependent variables were receptiveness and attitude change. And so excitingly, participants felt more receptive to the opposed framed essays than to the support framed essays, and that's consistent with the first study. But they found that the more receptive a participant thought they were, the greater the attitude change. So receptiveness leads to attitude change. So what now we know from these 3 studies that receptiveness is really important. That if you frame something in an opposed frame fashion, and when you're talking with someone who disagrees with you, people are more likely to be receptive to that information or to that message. And when they're more receptive, they're going to be more likely to engage with it, and they're going to be more likely to change their attitude as they engage with it. So this is really important. So in study 4, they really want to look at the mediator here. Is value congruence really what's creating this relationship? So they're exploring the role of value congruence, the role that it plays in the framing receptiveness relationship. And they want to rule out a bunch of other explanations. And table 3 of the article, I think, gives the best summary of all of the different explanations they're trying to rule out. So like one idea is, well, people, when you oppose something, it might mean that you're for it, or it might mean that the person's neutral toward it. Where if you are in favor of something, you know exactly where they stand. They're in favor of it. Neutrality is not a possibility. So to make sure that that's not what's playing a role here, they added some dependent variables where they're going to measure the perceived communicator's extremeness of the idea, the neutrality of their political stance, and how certain they are that they're correct. Another idea might be how that it's easier to counter argue opposed frame messages, that those come easier to mind. So because they're easy, it's easier to counter argue, then maybe that's what's causing the more receptiveness to the opposed framed messages. So they added in this study dependent variables of interest in counter-arguing and the perceived ease of counter-arguing. Another idea is perhaps when you frame something in an opposed frame way, it grabs our attention more because, you know, we're always things that are negative grab our attention more from an evolutionary perspective. That helps us to stay alive. It's more important that we're able to see things that might hurt us than things that are okay. So if that's the case, in order to explore if that's the case, they measured people's attention, their perceived relevance, and their ease of processing the message. And finally, another alternative is maybe just people are more receptive to opposed framed messages, not because it has anything to do with value congruence. It's just how it is. So they asked perceived communicators' receptiveness. So they were going to explore all these other options to see all these other ideas that could be explaining the relationship between framing and receptiveness. So in this study, again, they used a survey that had been done a long time ago where people had recorded their attitude toward legalizing abortion after 6 months, good, bad, or no opinion. I think that's supposed to be 6 weeks. Sorry about that. Then they were asked to participate in the study if they thought it was either good or bad. So again, no one with a neutral point of view is included in the study. Then they indicate their attitude toward legalizing abortion after 6 weeks. They indicate their attitude on a 1 to 7 scale. Then they read a message from a disagreeing other that's either support framed or oppose framed. Then they state whether the communicator took a position that agreed or disagreed with their own. They report their receptiveness to the message. They rate the message on value congruence, and then they answer a whole bunch of other questions that are all of these dependent variables. So the main independent variable is whether it was framed in a support way or an opposed way. But then they are asked questions about how receptive they are to the message, the value congruence, the communicator's attitude certainty, the communicator's attitude extremeness, the communicator's attitude neutrality, their interest in counter-arguing, the ease of counter-arguing, their perceived relevance, how much attention they pay, their ease of processing, the communicator's receptiveness. So all these things. And the results, consistent with study 1, participants felt more receptive to opposed frame than support frame messages. Also consistent with study 1, opposed frame messages were rated as more value congruent than support frame messages, okay? And the key thing here is they ran mediational analyses. And so they included all of these other dependent variables to see which of these variables is really playing a role in this relationship between framing and receptiveness. And what they found was that even though communicators' attitude certainty and communicators' extremeness and communicators' neutrality all did play a role, these other ones didn't. Attention didn't, ease of processing didn't, perceived tolerant relevance didn't, those didn't work. But even though some of them worked, the value congruence was way stronger. So what study 4 found was that basically the reason why opposed frame messages work better when you're talking with a disagreeing other is because the opposed frame message feels more value congruent to the receiver. And that's the value congruence is what leads to the receptiveness. Okay, and then on to study 5. With study 5, they're saying, well, if the frame receptiveness relationship is indeed due to value congruence, then if you show people a message they agree with, the result should flip. So therefore people should be more receptive to support frame messages because those will be the ones that are more value congruent if you're talking about a message you agree with than opposed frame messages. So here people were asked their attitude. Again, the surveys have been done before about 4 different topics: abortion, same-sex marriage, the importance of wearing a mask during COVID, and gun control. And then after we know about their opinions on these topics, then they read a message from the communicator and they report how receptive they felt, and then they report their value congruence. So it's very much like study 1 and study 4, like you're in the receiver role of study 1, and like study 4, but without the extra dependent variables. So the independent variables were the framing, whether the message was framed as you support or oppose, and the alignment. Was the message aligned to the participant's point of view, or was it was it against what the person thinks? So in studies 1, 2, and 3, and 4 so far, it's always been a values misaligned, right? You're getting to read a message of someone who has a different point of view. Here, half the people got a message that was different from theirs, half got a message that supported theirs. And the dependent variables were receptivity and value congruence. And consistent with the hypothesis, for all 4 topics, topic didn't matter at all, so they just combined across all 4 topics. Support framed, values aligned messages felt more value congruent and led participants to feel more receptive than opposed frame values. And again, this is for value aligned messages. In other words, you think you're talking to someone who agrees with you. But as in the prior studies, opposed framed values misaligned messages felt more value congruent and led participants to feel more receptive than support frame values misaligned messages. So when we're talking with disagreeing others, opposed frame messages feel like they align with our values more and lead us to be more receptive. But when we're talking to someone who agrees with us, then support framed messages feel more value congruent to us and lead to more receptiveness. And the mediational analysis confirmed that the value congruence is what mediates this relationship between framing and receptiveness. So in conclusion, 5 studies, a whole bunch of time and effort in this. People believe that disagreeing others will be more receptive to support frame messages, but in fact, they're actually more receptive to opposite or oppose framed messages. However, support frame messages lead to more receptivity among recipients who agree with the communicator. Value congruence mediates the relationship between framing and receptivity is really important. It leads to more engagement with the disagreeing messages, and it leads to more attitude change. The limitations of the study, the authors do a phenomenal job, I thought they did, outlining tons of different limitations. I direct you to table 5 in the article. They list and really explain a whole bunch of different limitations: generalizability across other cultures, generalizability across other mediums. All 5 studies and the supplementary studies were all done online. The attitudes were really extreme. What about neutral attitudes? What about it? Would this be the same in a different language? How much is support and opposed framing in a thing that has to do with speaking in English? Would it be different in different languages? So limitations, they discussed a whole bunch of them. And so that is my summary of the article. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope this summary sort of confirms what you thought was in the article, and you find that this was helpful. I hope that this is a good model for as you lead these article discussions. This is the kind of PowerPoint presentation that you want to make and how you want to lead through the article summary. Remember that when you are leading an article discussion, some of the people who are going to be listening to your discussion for extra credit and participating in the discussion for extra credit will not have read the article. So you want to go into enough detail that someone who hasn't read the article would understand it just from hearing your PowerPoint presentation. Okay. Now, I read the discussion questions that you guys wrote, and they're open to everyone. So you got to read the discussion questions that your classmates wrote. And I sort of categorized them. It seemed like almost or most of them really had to do with generalizability. And I'm sort of hard pressed to figure out what we should begin discussing. So I thought some of the generalizability issues that were sort of touched on in the article, but you guys really talked about them, and I think it would lead to a really good discussion is, okay, what is this really going to be like outside of this laboratory online discussion, right? Outside the lab in a real conversation that's face-to-face that we're talking, how important is this 1 or 2 sentence thing of how we're framing it? And I think I'd really like to hear your points of view of how much do you think this would generalize there? Have you been in any conversations where you use opposed framed messaging when you're talking to someone who disagrees with you? Do you think it helps? Do you know what I mean? Another of you brought up what would happen. I think 2 of you brought up, what if we talked about less polarizing topics? I mean, abortion, gun control, what were some of the other ones? Oops, I went too far back, sorry. It was gun control, abortion, same-sex marriage, wearing a mask in COVID. These are all pretty, polarizing topics. What would happen if we looked at a less polarizing topic, like do you think it's important that Cameron University offers a degree to create counselors? Do you know what I mean? Probably some of you really agree, some of you disagree. A lot of you are probably like, although you might feel strongly about it, it's not going to be the level of, all the debate that we hear online and everything, like some of these other topics. Also, two of you brought up, what about neutral participants? They kept, they only use people who either were very opposed or very for the issue. They didn't include the neutral participants. What kind of an effect would framing have there? And how does framing affect value congruence when you have got a neutral person? Because you might say neither view is going to be congruent with them. So then are they not receptive at all? Or because they're neutral, are they more receptive? That would be interesting I'd like to hear you guys discuss of what you think would happen if they did that study. And even though they use people that were polarized, that I'm sure some were much more strong in their attitude than others. How do you guys think that played a role in the study? And then a couple of you brought up, well, three of you brought up what would happen in real life multidisciplinary teams. So when you have a case manager and therapists and nurses creating a treatment plan in a healthcare institution, how would, in this real world situation, in a real conversation outside the lab, would opposed framing work in this situation? How about coaches and trainers and athletes all talking about, what would be the best way to train this or best training plan for a particular athlete or for a particular team? Again, in real conversations outside the lab, what with these three different people, that have different points of view, do you think opposed framing would really have that big of an impact? How about, I love this one. How about when teachers and parents are talking about young children? If you're teaching young children and the child's having some kind of a behavioral problem, it can be really difficult to talk about that with a parent who is not open to hearing that their child isn't perfect. How much would opposed framing work in that situation? Again, outside the lab in a real conversation with people with different points of view, but really have the same want, in this case, for their child to succeed, for the athlete or the team to win, a treatment plan for the client. So with these same objective but multidisciplinary teams, how much would opposed framing play a role? And I'd love to hear your opinion on that. Have you had conversations where you've tried opposed framing or support framing? Did they fall flat? What happened? And then one of you brought up ethical considerations in doing this. And, anytime you're going to bring up ethics, that always leads to a good discussion. So I'm going to sort of let you guys decide, whoever makes the first post, talk about any of these, what you think would generalize and what wouldn't, ethical considerations of doing this. Is it too manipulative to frame it away so that someone would be more receptive? So I look forward to our discussion. Remember, because this is all later, because of the university being closed down for the bad weather, we're only going to be discussing this. Today's Thursday, February 5th. We're only going to be discussing it this Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. So you have to have made your 2 posts in discussing this article by 11:59 p.m. Lawton time on Monday, February 9th. And because I'm on the East Coast right now, I'm visiting my parents here, it probably is going to say that it's due on Tuesday, February 10th at 1 a.m. in the morning, because that is Monday, February 9th at 11:59 p.m. So just be aware of that. It's due basically Monday before you go to bed. So, okay, I look forward to this discussion. I hope it goes well. Thank you.